Thank you for coming, everyone. I didn't realize before coming how much I shared in common with Condliffe, being at Berkeley and now spending some time in Christchurch. I'm really grateful for this invitation. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be giving this lecture, and hopefully I'll be able to do it in a way where you'll all leave feeling that you've learned something useful. Let's talk about online marketplaces, and broadly speaking, no one will argue that they're not a huge success story. We could think about goods or products like eBay. StubHub is a site where you buy secondary market tickets for events. Amazon marketplaces, which is the stuff sold on Amazon by third-party sellers. Alibaba, Etsy, and so on and so forth. The list is very long. We have marketplaces that are dedicated to labor markets. For example, Upwork is a site in the United States where you could go and hire people to design your webpage, to write some code for you, to design a logo, and many other tasks. TaskRabbit is where you could hire people to do errands for you or do certain simple jobs typically. SitterCity is babysitters. In transport, Uber I know exists here. Lyft I know does not exist here. We have Convoy that does middle mile matching between people who need delivery by trucking between longer distances, and Cargomatic who are in the same space. Accommodations, Airbnb. VRBO is actually an older site. Flipkey, HomeAway. And in finance, we have Prosper, Lending Club, where people need money, need loans, and they find lenders to lend them. These are all online marketplaces. And when I look around the room, I do see a distribution of ages, some young and promising, others maybe a little closer to me, who are on a different trajectory. The point is that I remember very vividly in 1996, roughly, when I first got introduced to the internet and went on Mozilla, and people started talking about this eBay, I'm like, this is going to fail. And it will fail because, you know, I have trouble trusting someone when I'm standing in front of them in a store. Am I going to buy something from someone halfway around the globe that I can't even talk to? And of course, that is not what happened. And importantly, one thing that differentiates marketplaces from online retailers is that it really does facilitate trade between anonymous buyers and sellers, where the whole notion of a brand is a little harder to take into account. Moreover, all these marketplaces do not directly control some of the key variables, like inventory or prices or quality, again, depending on which one we're talking about. And they are hosting a wide variety of sellers that are very different in what they do and how they do it, and in particular, in the quality of the service that they are providing. So how can markets flourish in the face of what we economists call this extreme asymmetric information, where buyers know almost nothing about the sellers, and sellers could indeed provide pretty crappy quality, or maybe even take the money and run type strategies? The answer that people have given is that reputation and feedback systems have really kept players in check. They have really been able to create this kind of ecosystem where the sellers care about the reputation they get, because if their reputation suffers, in the future buyers will not buy from them. Now, what I'd like to do is offer a tip of the iceberg approach to how economists think about this idea of reputation. Because if you think about this notion of reputation, you know, for what is a name like a rose, and I don't remember the exact Shakespeare quote, and the key is that economists like putting some kind of economic structure on problems that they deal with. And I'm going to walk through two of the common economic structures that economists have put on this problem, and then go and look at actual data and analyses based on data from real marketplaces, in particular eBay and Taobao. So I want you to think of the simplest way that an economist would try to model the idea of a transaction between a buyer and a seller. where that transaction is caricaturized in the following way. A buyer has to trust the seller or not. What does trust mean? Trust me would be opening my wallet, taking out $20 and giving it to the seller. Not trusting would mean just walking by the store and not doing anything. Then, if I do trust the seller and give the seller $20, the seller now has two options. They could take that fine product that they promised and give it to me and we both walk away with some gains from trade. Or they could basically give me an empty box and then when I come back screaming and say, sorry, you gave me your $20, I gave you a box, that's a transaction. And the way we could capture this is in the following way. If I'm the buyer and I walk by the seller's store and I don't trust, then I get nothing and the seller gets nothing. If on the other hand, I trust the seller, give the seller the $20, and the seller honors my trust by giving me the product, then we both get some value of 10, okay? So you could think of it in the following way, just to put numbers into these. If I give the seller $20 and it costs the seller $10 to produce that fine product, then on net, the seller will get $10 because he got 20 and it cost him 10. And let's imagine that I enjoy the product at a level that's equal to $30. So I gave away 20 and I got $30 worth of enjoyment. We're both getting $10. Now, if instead the seller abuses trust and I get a box that basically is worth nothing to me, or maybe it's worth $5 because I could sell it at a local store, then I'm left with negative 15, okay? And the seller had to give away that box that only cost 5, and he got 20, so the seller gets 15. Okay? This is what economists call the trust game. And you could use it as a caricature for this kind of transaction. It's also been used as a caricature for many other types of social interactions. Well, if we look at this little caricature of reality, here is how game theory would analyze this. Game theory would say, as a buyer, what should I do? Should I trust or not trust? Well, as a buyer, I have to form a belief about what the seller might do. And if I look at what the seller might do, I say the seller could honor trust or abuse trust. If the seller honors trust, the seller gets 10, and I get 10. If the seller abuses trust, the seller gets 15, and I get negative 15. What do I think the seller will do? Well, remember, in economics, everybody's kind of a schmuck, and they only take care of themselves. So if I anticipate that, then I anticipate that this seller is going to abuse my trust. And anticipating that, I should never trust the seller, and we will end up in this very sad outcome where there's no trade. Now, one of the things that economics realized is, oh, in reality, we know that there is a lot of trade. So how does that happen? And then they came up with the idea that, well, this game is a one-shot transaction. In reality, buyers come and buyers go and sellers are around and there's some future interaction. So what if this interaction between us is supposed to last for many, many, many periods? Then we could try to form a cooperative understanding where I, the buyer, expect you to honor trust. And you, the seller, anticipate that if you abuse trust, I will never trust you again. So now, in a way, the seller is faced with the following dilemma. I could abuse trust and get 15 now instead of 10, and that's $5 in my pocket. But then this buyer is never going to buy from me again, and I lost potentially many future 10s that I could have gotten. And of course, if I care enough about the future, I will honor rather than abuse trust. Right? So this is, repeated game theory in a nutshell. Okay? That's the idea that how economists view this value from transactions. Now, one of the things that is a little bit unsatisfactory about this theory of the world, and here I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, is that this theory does not really nail down too much about what does it really mean to have a reputation. Because here a reputation is just the belief that you're going to do things because it's in your best interest. And often when we think about reputations, we like using language like, oh, that person, she's a really honest person. Or that guy, he's really shady. What does honest and shady mean here? It's really nothing of material You can't really capture that here in this simple setting. I'm going to show you a much more complicated setting, but don't try to exactly follow the fine details here. I just want to give you an idea of how economists try to capture that more rich setting where people kind of have certain personalities, let's call them, trustworthy, not trustworthy, and so on. And how do we do that in game theory? Well, we say, there are two types of sellers. Some sellers are very trustworthy. What are trustworthy sellers? When you trust them, the only thing they could do is honor trust. The idea of abusing someone is just incomprehensible. And then let's call these, rational sellers, because in economics you're rational if you just take care of yourself. And these rational sellers, they would very happily abuse trust in this setting. Okay? Well, now I as a buyer have to start thinking about, I meet someone for the first time. Are you an honest person or are you one of those rational economic types? If I think you're an honest person with a high enough probability, then I would want to trust you, knowing that I might be taking a risk. So now we start thinking about the probability that I, the buyer, think that you're honest versus the probability that I think you are opportunistic or this selfish type. And now we could capture this idea of beliefs. And then as we interact, I might update my beliefs. In particular, if we interact once and you honor my trust, I'll say, this person really is honest. But now that means that people who may be a little more opportunistic, they have an incentive to behave as if they are honest, because that's how they get more future business. By convincing people that they're more honest than they might be, and that alone might give them the incentive to keep being honest because they want others to believe that they are honest. So game theory has this nice richness that we can write down these little toy caricature models to get at these ideas of people behaving in more honest ways, the idea of a belief being, a reasonable capture of how people are interacting in the marketplace. So now, with that kind of theory behind us, so that we have some ways of capturing these situations and then maybe trying to shed light on when do we think in the world it's more likely to be a case where you will have good reputations or not. Let's go to the practice side. And I'm going to start with eBay because eBay was the pioneer of creating online reputation systems. And here's how it worked in eBay. By the way, how many people here have ever bought something on eBay, just out of curiosity? Okay, good number. Do you have Amazon here in New Zealand yet? Mm-hmm. Oh, you do. How many people have bought on Amazon? Okay, yeah, the number has to be bigger. Because right now in the US, if I go to a random crowd, how many people bought on eBay? Depending on the age distribution, like younger people, they never even go to eBay anymore. And when I ask, I don't have to ask how many people buy on Amazon because it's always the same number, 100% in the US. So eBay really was the pioneer. So as some of you, many of you know, after you buy something on eBay, you choose to leave feedback. You could leave positive feedback, negative feedback, neutral feedback, or no feedback. You could just decide, I'm done with the transaction and I'm not leaving any feedback. What eBay then does, it creates these reputation or feedback metrics that it then displays back to future buyers. In particular, the first thing they calculate is what they call percent positive. And here's how they do it. They take the number of positive ratings and divide them by the total number of ratings, negative plus positive, where neutral is ignored. Then they create something that they call the seller feedback score, which is the positive minus the negatives. If you really wanted to know how many positives and how many negatives someone had, then with these two numbers you could calculate it because you have two equations with two unknowns. Not that anybody necessarily would want to do that, but you can. Then eBay does something else. They create these badges where a seller that has enough good behavior according to eBay is going to get a badge that says, this is a trusted seller. In fact, it's called ETRS, eBay Trusted Seller. And we know that many sites have copied some version or another of eBay's feedback system. Many of them use stars, 1 star to 5 stars, so there are all sorts of variations, but this is really where it all began. And more detailed information can also be solicited. So for example, eBay, after you leave feedback, and only after you leave this positive, negative, neutral, will they solicit what they call detailed seller ratings, where they'll ask something like, was the item as described, 1 to 5 stars? How was the communication with the buyer, 1 to 5 stars? And we're trying to get a little more information. And again, this has been copied by other sites, so I think Uber does this too, but I know for sure Lyft does it. After you leave 5 stars or 4 stars, they'll ask pleasant driver, clean car, fun conversation, and you could click any of those to give more detailed ratings. So this is what eBay collects, and this is what it actually looks like if you go to the eBay site. So here I did a search for an Apple 13.3-inch MacBook computer. I selected one of them, and here we see that computer. It's being offered at $1,279.99 at 30% to get it into New Zealand dollars. It's kind of awesome being in New Zealand. Everything's cheap. Except gasoline. Gasoline is really expensive here.
Well, cigarettes.
Well, I don't smoke, so that's a good thing. Gasoline being expensive, we could argue about that. Okay, and here is the seller information. So I'm going to take this box and blow it up. Okay, here's that box. See, it was right there. I'm blowing it up. First of all, you see that badge, top rated plus. That's eBay saying, we trust the seller more than some others. Here you see the score, 21,814, meaning that the positives minus the negatives is this number. And then you have 99.2% positive feedback. Now, I don't know about people in this room. I'm sure everyone here is extremely accomplished. I had a pretty decent career and outcome and all that. I did not have a GPA in my undergrad of 99.2%. Okay? That strikes me as an extremely high number. So when I see this number and I don't know anything else, that strikes me like an amazingly good score. Okay? Well, this is the actual distribution of percent positive on feedback based on internal data. This data is a few years old, but I still have a lot of friends who work in the company. It's no different. The blue is weighted by transactions. The red is weighted by dollar amounts. The red is just the actual distribution. I want you to first notice that I started this at 98%, because if I started at 0, it would just look like a hockey stick, okay? And even at 98%, it still pretty much looks like a hockey stick. What is this information telling me? Well, the median percent positive is 100, which means that more than 50% of sellers on eBay have 100% positive feedback. And the mean is 99.3%. So that person there, that company that was selling 99.2, they're below average. The 10th percentile is 97.8%. So if you see that 97%, that's like the garbage sellers, okay? And of course, we could think of two worlds that we might be living in. World one is that sellers sell on eBay. The minute they become slightly imperfect, people stop buying from them, they disappear, and we're only left with the best and the brightest, okay? I don't know if anyone here was familiar with a podcast that was kind of popular on National Public Radio in the US called The Prairie Home Companion. Yeah? Okay, where all the children are above average, right? And this is the case where, yes, everyone seems to be above average. Of course, case 2 would be that the feedback is heavily biased. That for some reason, these numbers are not representing the true quality of sellers. And I'm going to try to convince you that that's really what has been going on, not only on eBay, but as quite prominently across other websites. This is a caricature I found some years ago. If it has 5 stars, it probably only has 1 review. 4.5 is excellent, 4 is okay, and everything else is crap. And that pretty much is a decent representation of what is going on in online marketplaces. The question, of course, is why? Well, here I want to go to the motivation behind the research direction that this realization took me on, and share with you how I'm thinking about the way in which economists and data scientists more broadly can help marketplaces increase the quality of goods sold and the trust that they will get from buyers on the marketplace. I first want to start with a quote from Al Roth, who wrote this paper in 2002 on the kind of engineering approach to market design. Al Roth, for those who don't know, is a Nobel laureate in economics. He got his Nobel Prize, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And he wrote almost 70 years ago, market designers, which are kind of the group of economics who are interested in designing the details of how certain markets operate, and there are many different applications, cannot work only with simple conceptual models used for theoretical insights into the general working of markets. Instead, market design calls for an engineering approach. And where Al, I think, really hit the nail on the head here is that in economics, and I know there are a few economists in the room, there is this tendency to write extremely elegant mathematical representations of a problem, but that really limits your ability to solve the problem. It gives great insights into some fundamental natures of a problem, and those are important, especially for broad policy type of discussions. However, when you're really trying to solve a problem, you have to reach a point where you're going to be cutting corners just like engineers do. You know, oh, I only have 3 screws. Well, that's okay. I'll use 3 because it gets me 95% of the way, and let me release this because it's good enough. And there's a bit of a tension between the kind of academic approach and the engineering approach. In particular, where I think this is important is to realize that feedback is user-generated content, which is not the way the pristine theoretical models are captured in reputation. So to give you an idea of that, go back to that little caricature I gave, right, where trust of user honor, and imagine this is played again and again and again. In models of reputation that people write down, there is the understanding that histories are perfectly observable to the future buyers. So I, as a buyer, coming after 27 buyers bought from a seller, I know exactly everything that transpired before me. Well, in reality, that doesn't happen. And in reality, that feedback, even if it's there, is not generated by some kind of oracle that gives you the truth. It's generated by users who give you some impression of what they went through. And being able to understand the incentives that that are behind how feedback is created, which is going to tell you how feedback is biased, is important to understand how to untangle the truth from that potentially biased information. And what marketplaces can do is supplement feedback with other sources of internal data that I will go into and show you, and in particular do it in 3 possible ways. One is certification badges, like I showed you that badge, Trusted Seller. I'm not going to talk about that. I have done some recent research with some co-authors, Shang Gui, who's an assistant professor at WashU in St. Louis, Mariam Saidi at Carnegie Mellon, sorry, this is not research that I've done. This is research that they've done, and then Shang and Mariam and I have continued along that line to better understand how these certification methods affect the distribution of quality. I'm going to talk about the second alternative, which is paternalistically matching buyers with sellers. And I'm going to talk in particular about 2 papers that I've written with co-authors who have spent some time with me at eBay. This is Chris Moscow, who now is at Amazon. Dmitry Masterov is now at a marketplace called Thumbtack. And Uwe Meyer is still at eBay. By the way, this is another thing that's common in Silicon Valley. You're at a company 1 year, usually 3 years later you're working for someone else. And that's not held against you. If anything, that's a badge of honor. And finally, I will talk about a third alternative of letting sellers engage in costly signaling. And I'll be more precise about, and hopefully clear, what I mean by costly signaling. And this is based on some recent work that I've done with two colleagues, Ivy Li and Xiaolan Zhao, who are in Shanghai using data from Taobao. So this is just a bit of a roadmap towards where we're going. So let me start with the work that I've done with Chris Nosko. We came to the conclusion, without yet proving it, that the feedback on eBay has to be biased. And biased in what way? Biased in a way where people who have bad experiences choose not to leave negative feedback. Now you might ask yourself, why would someone choose not to leave negative feedback? Well, there are many reasons. Let's start with an appeal to human kindness. People are generally kind. They don't like, pissing over other people. So if I had a bad experience, I'm like, you know what, I'll just let it go. I won't badmouth anyone, even though I had a bad experience. Now, you can think of other reasons that people might actually realize that there could be a negative cost to leaving negative feedback, or a large cost to leaving negative feedback. Let me give you two examples. We found a newspaper article about 6 years ago or so. A student from Colorado State University bought a bicycle from a seller on eBay. Got the bicycle, it really was not up to snuff, left negative feedback. Now, the seller sent the bicycle to the student. So he had the student's name, the address, he actually had the phone number of the student as well, and within a day, the student had a message on his voicemail from the seller saying, "Don't you play games with me, I will follow you to your grave." Okay? Similarly, a buyer in the UK bought a $40 alarm clock on eBay, left the seller negative feedback because something was wrong, and then the seller sued the buyer for defamation. Now, of course, it's a frivolous lawsuit, but you have to hire a lawyer, you have to deal with all that. If you read the newspaper and you read those articles, you think to yourself, I just bought this item for 15 bucks. I'm not going to read negative feedback. Because what if this happens to me? So that could be a reason that people don't read negative feedback. Now, what that would then imply is that if I have a good experience, nothing bad happens to me from leaving positive feedback. If I have a bad experience, I'm taking a risk by leaving negative feedback. So that will then mean that if I had a bad experience, I'll be more likely to not leave feedback than if I have a good experience. Which then means that silence itself is capturing two types of buyers. Buyers who are true economic rational actors, because an economic rational actor should never leave feedback. Why leave feedback? It takes 20 seconds of my time and other people benefit from it. So any good-hearted economist would not leave feedback. But of the better people, so to speak, those who don't leave feedback are going to be people who probably had a bad experience. Now, if we take that hypothesis seriously, it means that we could create a new measure of reputation. I'll call it effective percent positive. And instead of doing what eBay does, which is positive divided by positive plus negative, I will add silence into the denominator. In other words, silence is going to be held against you as a seller. So here's the example. I'm going to take seller A and seller B. Let's imagine that seller A and seller B both have one negative. They both have 99 positives, but seller A has only 20 silence, and seller B has 50 silent transactions. Well, using eBay's percent positive, they will both have a score of 99%, which is 99 divided by 99 plus 1. However, our effective percent positive measure is now going to add 20 to the denominator of A and 50 to the denominator of B, so that A is going to have an effective percent positive 82.5%, and B is going to have 66%. Now, according to our hypothesis, A is a better seller than B, which I have yet to prove. But that's the hypothesis. Well, let's first look at what the distribution of effective percent positive looks like. Remember what the distribution of percent positive looks like, right? More than half the people have 100%, almost no one exists below 97.8%. This is the distribution of effective percent positive. So people who are familiar with kind of information theory is like, oh wow, there's information here. There really is a distribution. The mean and median were around 63, 64%. The standard deviation was about 14%, which means that there were quite a lot of people sitting between roughly 56% and 78%. And then you have tails with really, really good people and really, really bad people. And this already tells us that there is information here that doesn't exist in the percent positive. Now, the question is this really a measure of seller quality? And what we did as economists, we use a method that economists call revealed preference. Okay? What is revealed preference? Well, the way in which it's mostly used is the following. Imagine that I take a banana and an apple. And I go to this gentleman here and I say, look, they both cost $1. Which one do you want to buy? If this gentleman buys an apple, this tells me that this gentleman likes apples more than bananas. Why? Because they both cost $1, so the cost is the same, and he chose an apple. Therefore, he must like apples more than bananas. Because if he liked bananas more than apples, he wouldn't have chosen the apple. Right? And then we could use that to do all sorts of analyses. What we do here is the following exercise. We will say, someone buys something from a seller. Take this away before so you're not distracted by the words. Now let's imagine that I take two random people who came to eBay. One of them bought from seller A and another bought from seller B. Now I will ask myself, what did they do afterwards? Did they both come back to eBay, or did only one of them come back, or neither of them came back? And our revealed preference argument will be the following. If you came to eBay and transacted with a higher quality seller, you should be happier. And if you're happier, you should be willing to come back to eBay again. In other words, if I took a random sample of 100 people, and I gave them someone who has a high EPP according to our measure, and then I took a random sample of 100 people and I gave them sellers with a low EPP, I should see that people from the first group were more likely to come back to eBay than people from the second group. And if I see that, I have proven that indeed this is a better seller based on the idea that better sellers will create more repeat business. Okay? That's the idea behind it. So, what have we done? We took a cohort of new users who joined eBay in the US site anytime between 2011, anytime in 2011, and we tracked them for roughly 3.5 years on average, so up till May 31, 2014. We took a 10% random sample, and that was almost 1 million buyers. This was one of the great things, when you looked at economic research done 20, 30 years ago, you had a sample size of 250, 300 people. That's really awesome. You had 1,000, this is big data. Now things are a little different. So using the whole universe, 10 million people, we just couldn't do the analysis on the computer. So we restricted to a 10% sample. And the data tracked everything that they did over that 3.5 period. What they looked at, what they bought, whether they came back, what they bought again, what they paid for, how much, what kind of seller, everything. Then it turns out that these almost 1 million buyers transacted with almost 2 million sellers over that 3.5 year period. And for every seller, we have the information, including their feedback score and percent positive. And what we could do then is, for every seller, when they had a transaction, because we have the internal eBay data, we could calculate their effective percent positive at that moment. So now we have our own measure for every seller at any given time. And then we're going to apply this data to the revealed preference framework. Okay? So here is the conceptual idea that the economic theorist would take to this problem. A buyer comes to eBay. And this buyer is going to either buy something or not. And if they buy something, they have a choice. They leave eBay forever, or they go on and buy a second item. And after that second item they buy, they could leave eBay or buy a third item, and so on and so forth. So, if I put this structure on the problem, it tells me that I could model people as realizations of when did you leave eBay, if at all. Maybe you're still continuing to purchase. So this is what we would call a dynamic Bayesian decision problem. And the underlying idea is every time I have an experience on eBay, that will determine whether I wish to continue buying on eBay or not. The better the experience I have, the more likely I am to continue. The worse the experience, the less likely I am to continue. This model of behavior has a further implication. If someone already transacted many times on eBay, the likelihood that they're going to leave eBay on the next transaction is much lower than if they only transacted once. And that's going to be for two reasons. First of all, some people just like the experience of eBay, regardless of the quality of the transaction. And of course, those are the people who are more likely to buy a lot, so you get a selected sample of people who like eBay. A second reason is, if I bought many times, I probably had a lot of good experiences. Therefore, one bad experience after 20 good ones will not be as influential as one bad experience after 2 experiences. So now I have a quantifiable way of looking at the problem and saying that if a buyer interacts with a better seller, according to my measure, they should be more likely to move down this tree. And the impact of the quality of the seller should be more important earlier than it is later because of those 2 reasons. Right? So now we have this theoretical way of thinking of the problem that we could take to the data. So, don't run. I know for some of you this is going to look like Greek, and there is a little bit of Greek. But let me give you the idea behind this for those who are less familiar with the kinemetric modeling. Remember the idea, the intuition. I want to know, are you coming back or not coming back? And I want to know whether the seller effective percent positive is influencing that. So every time you buy something on eBay, I'm going to create a variable that I call, did you come back afterwards? And that's a 0-1 variable. Okay? Those are going to be my y's. Okay? Y could be a 0 or 1. Just to give you some idea, what does YIT mean? It means that buyer I, I have almost 1 million buyers, each one of them has a name, an ID. Buyer I bought something in period T, where T would mean, is this your first time, second, third, 10th? Whether or not you came back another time afterwards. Then I'm going to regress this on a whole bunch of information. First of all, EPP, the effective percent positive of the seller, J, from which you bought that teeth item. So your 7th item, who's the seller you bought it from? What was their effective percent positive? And my theory says that this coefficient should be positive. Meaning, if you bought from a seller with a higher effective percent positive, you should be more likely to come back and buy again afterwards. Then we're throwing in a whole bunch of controls. What's the type of product that you bought? How long has your seller been on board? What's the price? All sorts of other things that we just want to make sure that we're accounting for them. Okay? And importantly, we also want to see whether you're coming back to eBay and whether you're coming back to the same seller. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, first of all, as you can imagine, the likelihood that anybody comes back to the same seller on a place like eBay is very, very low. But it happens. The reason this is important is because in economics we have this idea that we call an externality. Something that you do that affects other people. Well, think of yourself as a seller on eBay. When you do good, then you're making the buyer happier. That buyer is more likely to come back to eBay, meaning that you might enjoy it and other people might enjoy it. But if you think that you're not going to enjoy it that much because the likelihood that they come back to you is smaller, then your behavior becomes a public good for the whole platform. And that means that eBay should have an interest in you behaving well more than you yourself have that interest. Because eBay is that marketplace and you are just one of many sellers. So we could again prove that by looking at the differences between these likelihoods. So let me jump to the results and tell you what we find. These are the results from a regression equation. I'm going to blow this top up because we control for a bunch of things, because this is where the interesting action is. So here's the interesting action. remember that I'm asking whether you return to the same seller or to eBay, and I expect that any good thing that a seller will do will be much more influential on whether you return to eBay than to the seller. Now, what did we do? We created what we call dummy variables for different levels of the EPP, because we don't want to impose a certain structure like a linear structure. In econometrics, we call this a non-parametric approach. So we're basically dividing these sellers into really crappy, kind of okay, pretty good, excellent, based on our measure of EPP. Okay? And then here's what we show. The likelihood that you return to the same seller if you are in that second category, one above the crap, is 0.5% almost, more than those people that are in the bottom of that EPP spectrum. If you're already in the second one, it jumps up to about 2%, which is the same as the, sorry, this is the third, this is the second, the first one is excluded, and which is the same about the fourth. So we see that indeed, the better you are, the more likely you are to cause someone to return to you. But now look at the likelihood that you return to eBay. 0.5%, 2%. 2%, 3%. 2%, 4%. Indeed, the effect on returning to eBay is a lot higher, and it exactly works in the direction that that theory suggests, that that hypothesis suggests. The better you are on EPP, the more likely it is that you will cause the buyer to come back to eBay. Now, I want to pause here and say, we look at the same time at something else. We also included the percent positive in these same analyses. So, regardless of how this influences your decision as a buyer, let's look at percent positive. And here's what we found. Remember that almost more than half the people have 100%. So we did the following. Let's distinguish between people below 99.4%, which are, really the bottom of the barrel of percent positive. People that are between 99.4 and 100% not inclusive, and all the people that are 100%. And let's see how each one of these affects the probability that you come back to eBay, where we're still controlling for the EPP. Okay? And this is what we found, that when we showed this to the eBay executives, their first reaction was, we thought you people are smart, but you seem kind of stupid, because what does this tell me? It tells me that someone that has 100% positive feedback is less likely, these are negative numbers, to cause the buyer to return to eBay than someone with a lower percent positive. And this just doesn't make any sense. To which we smiled and said, notice what you just said. These people cause versus those people. Now, economists in general, and applied econometricians in particular, are very obsessed with the difference between causation and correlation. Okay? So for example, the data shows that during the time that people eat more ice cream, there's more shark attacks. Okay? That's a fact. And of course, the conclusion should be that eating ice cream causes shark attacks. And we know that that's not true because there's something that we call, spurious correlation or selection. Summer causes people to eat ice cream. Summer causes people to jump into the ocean. And people jumping into the ocean causes shark attacks. Therefore, there's a correlation that is not causal. What's going on here? And this is the important difference between percent positive and effective percent positive. Remember, when a buyer comes to eBay, they see this. They see the percent positive. Here's what they don't see. They don't see the effective percent positive, because eBay never showed it. Which means that people cannot choose sellers based on the effective percent positive. But they can choose sellers based on percent positive. Now, Richard told me earlier that he has a couple of kids, 20-year-old, 13-year-old. He may decide to buy one of them a gift, a 1972 vintage Gibson Les Paul electric guitar. Okay? Now, these are good guitars. They're quite expensive, but you know, vintage, they're used. And you're not going to find them that easily on Amazon or in the store, and eBay will be exactly the kind of place where you will find them. Now imagine that Richard, who never bought anything on eBay, he thinks it's full of charlatans and you know, crap sellers, and therefore, he's really worried. So question one, what kind of seller is he really looking for? 100% positive. Question two, given his attitude for eBay, does he plan on coming back to eBay? Absolutely not. Now we get a spurious correlation. People who don't want to deal with eBay, when they're forced to, they choose 100% positive sellers and then they don't come back. So when we're just pulling data and running regressions, we have to be very careful about how we're interpreting the results. If there's selection, we need to be worried because we can't make causal statements. When we explain that to the executive, they're like, okay, we understand now. Whereas the other results here are indeed causal because there is no way of buyers selecting on those measures. Now, that tells us that eBay has hidden data that they could use to match buyers to sellers. Well, there are different ways that that could be done, okay? One is to maybe show buyers the effective percent positive and say, no, no, use this to select your seller. Let me brush that aside for a second because I'm going to come back to that later. The alternative way is to take on a little more of a paternalistic approach. Okay, so let me jump directly to what I mean by that. This is what eBay looks like when you search for something. So you see I put in MacBook Air in the search. I did search, and then you get a list of things. Now, this is the first page of many, many pages because there are many, many MacBook Airs. What eBay is doing here is they're deciding what they should show you when they see you search for MacBook Air. This is the first, this is the second, this is the third, and it goes on and on and on. What determines what appears here in the search? Well, eBay has a team of scientists and a team of applied scientists and a team of engineers who are building algorithms to help decide what you should see when you search for a query. The same is true on Yelp and on Amazon and on any other marketplace that you go to. Historically, the main driver of what goes into these algorithms, initially it was kind of hardwired, later it was machine learning algorithms, was what's the likelihood that you're going to buy that? Okay? So the price, the presentation, the pictures, all sorts of things. What never went in there is what's the likelihood that this is going to make you happy so that you come back to eBay? So what we did is we convinced eBay to run the following experiment. You have an algorithm. Why don't you modify the algorithm to include the effective percent positive in the algorithm? So for example, if this is the ranking without effective percent positive, and suddenly this number 3 that doesn't have as nice a picture as number 1 is ranked 3rd, but when you look at the EPP, this seller just walks on water, and this seller is not that great. Maybe this should go up to 1 and this should go down to 3. Okay? That's what the EPP effect would be. So the way we did this is we conducted an experiment. We treated the ranking algorithm to incorporate EPP, and we ran this for about 2 weeks on 10% of eBay's US site. That gave us about 5 million searches per day. And the way we do these things in marketplaces or in any other online system is through what we call cookies. So when you search for something, you go to a site, then the site drops a cookie on your browser, and then it identifies. It might not know who you are, but of course if you log in and you don't erase your cookie, you'll also know exactly who you are. Okay? So we did this classic treatment control like you have in medical experiments, placebos and the real drug, the same idea here. We collected data both during and after the experiment. And this is again where our experiment differed wildly from the experiments that eBay was used to doing. Because what do these A/B testing, as they're called in the tech world, do? Well, they want to see, maybe if we have a pink background, people are going to buy more. So during the experiment, they see if people buy more. We weren't interested if people buy more during the experiment. We wanted to know if they'll come back more in the future. Now, indeed, eBay said, you know, our algorithm is optimized for people to buy more. So if you muck it up, people are going to buy less. We're like, okay, fair enough, which is why eBay didn't turn the dial on the experiment a lot, and EPP had a very small effect. But we said, let's measure how much we did. Because if indeed you're doing a good job optimizing, and if we change it a little bit, it should still be pretty good at optimizing conversion. Well, here are the results from that experiment. And basically, just to summarize what all these numbers are, we showed that people who were in the treatment where they got exposed to higher EPP sellers were significantly more likely to come back to eBay within a 3-month period. And the results, once you controlled for enough variables, were almost identical to the other empirical analysis we did, which was not an experiment, and it validated that idea that people just couldn't select on EPP because they didn't see it. Now, the other thing that we showed is this is the difference between treatment and control, the red and the blue. Here's the difference on the conversion rate. Because the people at eBay said, wait, you know, this is optimized to conversion. Well, we only changed it a little bit, and the effect on conversion was 0, which means we could have cranked it up even more. So what this showed that including EPP really didn't change the conversion rate because they hardly budged it, but it did have a change in the likelihood of people coming back, which means that the marketplace could use it as a method to increase the quality of matches between buyers and sellers. Now, by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, if anybody has any questions, please interrupt me at any time. I also want to see how I'm doing on time. I'll try to wrap it up in about 10 minutes because I want to leave some time for a Q&A. So you might ask, okay, fine, why not show people EPP? Okay, well now let's think about it for a second. Let's imagine that I show you EPP. Well, first I have to assume that you're actually going to infer something from it, which already might be a big assumption. Whereas if the marketplace knows quality, they could play with the ranking. Let's imagine that you are paying attention to it. And now you bought something from a seller, and you didn't leave them feedback. What's that seller going to do? They're going to harass you with emails. Because now the seller knows that when you don't leave feedback, you're hurting them. You're going to start getting emails. Leave me feedback, leave me feedback. To which your response is, I'm leaving eBay, I'm leaving eBay. Because you don't want all those harassing emails. So it's in eBay's best interest to find ways to change the way you observe sellers without sellers knowing exactly how they're doing it. Because if sellers know how they're doing it, you could bias the unbiased results. Okay? Now, I want to quickly go over another exercise we did. So here you see some data from about 44 million transactions that occurred during October 2011. 1 month, 44 million transactions. A lot of stuff gets sold on eBay. Remember, negative feedback hardly ever happens, indeed, only 0.4% of transactions. Here's just an interesting fact. Disputes filed, over 1%. Filing a dispute is a pain in the ass. Leaving negative feedback is 1 click. And even with that difference, almost 3 times as many people have leave disputes than leaving negative feedback. But this is what we focused on, because here's what we thought. I buy something on eBay. After I buy it, I get it to my house, I open the box. If I'm happy, I'm happy. What do I do if I'm unhappy? Well, eBay has a mediated message platform where buyers could contact sellers. They started it because eBay started by selling used and stuff, and maybe you had questioned the seller. Oh, it doesn't say what year you bought this. Please let me know. Okay, I want to know how old it is. Or I looked at the picture and I think there's a scratch. Is there really a scratch? So the whole idea of communication was to help pre-transaction interactions. Now, again, if I put on my hat as an economist, you should never send the seller an email after the transaction if you were happy. Because if you were happy, you got what you wanted, you paid, you were done. But if you're unhappy, that gives you a reason to send an email to the seller. Now, furthermore, we could do a little more analysis. So one of the many applications of machine learning is what's called natural language processing. And this is a method where you try to extract the content or the meaning or the sentiment of a message from words that are used. The simplest approach is what's called bag of words, where you kind of create a bunch of words that you know are bad. Transactions would be late, broken, where is it, not what I ordered, and so on and so forth. And then you look for those terms in emails, and you could then designate that email as a bad email. Well, first of all, we had almost 9% of transactions with post-transaction emails. Of those, more than a third had bad information in them. And here is an example of what those would be, and this is based on work that I did with Dmitry Masterov and Uwe Meyer that was published in Electronic Commerce Journal in 2016. EC15 was the name of that version, of that conference. So, should buyers send messages after a transaction is completed? Here's what our model, our machine learning algorithm, would designate as this is not a bad email. Hello and good morning. I'm glad to tell you the 2 items arrived safely. I'm very happy. I needed them for a dinner party. Thanks a lot, kind regards. Okay? In any economic textbook, this person should not exist. Okay? But these people exist. Here is a negative email. I purchased 2 pairs of shorts from you at the same time, 1 pair gold red, which I have received, and 1 pair red, which I haven't received. Bingo, that's a negative sign. Okay? So this would be classified as a negative transaction email. This would be classified as a neutral transaction email because we didn't find anything negative. Now, here is a simple way, a simple plot to look at the correlation between the type of email, if there is an email, and other indications in the data that this was a bad transaction. So you see that we have most, remember, only 8.93%, so about 91% had no emails. Of the 9% roughly that had emails, a little less than 6% were neutral, and a little more than 3% were negative. Here we see that transactions with no messages, only 4% of transactions were labeled as poor given all the other data we have up here. Of those that were neutral, that jumps from about 4% to about 13%. And for those that our algorithm identified as negative emails, more than 30% had other indications of bad outcomes for the buyer. So now we have another source of information, the email content and the sentiment from the email, which now means that the platform could go ahead and rank sellers based on the average quality of emails that they generate. When we did the analysis, we found that this information was what we call orthogonal to the EPP, meaning it didn't overlap almost at all and gave us an additional layer of valuable information, which then could be included into the search algorithm. So I'm going to skip the next 2 slides because that's basically what it was. And now let me jump to the third and last application before I wrap up, and that is the work that I did with Ivy and Xiaolan using the Taobao data, where the question was, how could we induce buyers to leave more honest feedback? And how could good sellers build a reputation that they deserve? And let me ignore this for a second because I'll jump into it. And why is this an important question for marketplace design? Because let's imagine that the marketplace has been around for a while, and now you have a bunch of sellers with great reputation. Now imagine that a new seller comes by with no reputation. They want to try to sell a product. You come to the site. You see a bunch of sellers selling it, and there's one seller with no reputation and one seller with 10,000 positives. Who are you going to buy from? The 10,000 positives. Maybe if there's too big a price gap, you might take a risk, but otherwise you won't. What does that mean? It means that reputation becomes a barrier to entry. Reputation of some sellers makes it harder for new sellers to come in. Some of those new sellers may be as good or even better. How are they going to survive? Well, we took a page from a very old idea of Philip Nelson in 1970, which was advertising as a signal of quality. So here's a summary of what basically Nelson said. He said, look, Imagine there are two types of sellers in the world. Reliable, good sellers and kind of crappy sellers. Now, if you go and you buy something from a seller and you don't know whether it's good or crappy, you're taking a chance. If you found out that it's a good seller, what are you going to do afterwards? You're going to buy from them again. And if you found out that it's a crappy seller, what are you going to do? You're not going to buy from them again. So now here's something a seller could do. A seller could open their wallet, pull out a $50 funny money thing, and basically say, look, you know that I'm only making $10 of profit for every item I'm selling. So I'm going to take this $50 bill and I'm literally going to burn it in front of you. And now I want you to try my product. If my product is a shitty product, you're not going to buy it again. So I'm only going to make $10 from that transaction. And I burned 50, so I lost $40. But if it's a good product, I know you're going to come back again and again, and eventually I'll sell more than 5 and I'll make money. Now, what if I'm a crappy seller? Well, if I burn this $50, I'm going to lose 40, because you're only going to try me once. So this becomes a way in which good sellers could differentiate themselves from bad sellers. That was his theory of advertising. Advertising is about telling the world, I'm good, because if I weren't good, I wouldn't burn this money. Okay? So that helps differentiate the good from the bad. What did we basically infer from this is that we could take this idea and apply it to a marketplace in the following way. Let sellers pay buyers to leave their reputation. If they're good, it will be in their interest to pay for that because they're going to get good feedback. If they're bad, it won't be in their interest to pay for that because they're going to get bad feedback. But of course, that only would work if indeed sellers would pay buyers regardless of the feedback that they leave. So we have to take away the payment from the seller and give it to some third arbitrator. And that arbitrator has to decide when to pay the buyers for their feedback. And this was the idea behind Taobao's rebate for feedback. Basically, sellers, right, the idea is high quality sellers would get positive, low quality sellers would get negative. However, how are we going to make that happen so that we will indeed get this separation, which of course will help solve the cold start problem because now good buyers could pay for the reputation. You have to take away the seller from the equation of paying the buyers. And this is exactly what Taobao did. They launched this rebate for feedback where sellers can choose rebates as cash or in-store credit. The rebate is conditional on leaving what's called high-quality feedback. High-quality feedback is not positive or negative, it's that there is content to the feedback. How is that determined? Taobao had a machine learning algorithm that basically read through the characters of the feedback to determine if this is relevant for the product. Then, the Taobao will mediate the transfer of rewards so that the seller really uses Taobao as kind of an escrow. The seller says, here's 100 RMB, right, the Chinese currency. I want to pay 1 RMB for every buyer that leaves feedback. And then Taobao has that money, a buyer leaves feedback. If the algorithm decides this is high quality feedback, the buyer gets paid. And if the algorithm decides, no, this feedback doesn't have information, the buyer doesn't get paid. If it's positive or negative, that doesn't matter. It is the content that it's relevant for the product. So the seller really does give up that as if they are burning money. The theory suggests that only good sellers would choose to do that, and that would help them build a reputation. So I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to tell you that this is just the number of Chinese characters. The gray is those with a rebate, those without. Clearly people left more characters, more informative feedback when they had rebates for feedback. This is telling us that the buyers seem to understand that rebate is a good sign because they buy a lot more than those without a rebate. And finally, and again, I'm not going to go through the econometrics of this, but what we showed is that it is the good quality sellers based on measures of per period reputations that shows the rebate for feedback. So we did get this kind of good using it, bad not using it, and they use it as a way to solve the cold start problem. So I want to conclude with a few challenges. So first of all, cognition and gaming. Economists use what we call equilibrium theory. Okay? In equilibrium theory, by definition, these are these mathematical models where no one is ever wrong, no one is ever surprised. And this is where you have to take a step back and remember an important truth, which is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is. So when we take these theoretical equilibrium models and try to apply them to the real world, we're already kind of, short-circuiting our ability to understand certain elements of reality, even though these models are very useful in getting some first-order things explained. They're not going to take us all the way to solutions. So should marketplace give information to people, or should they be paternalistic and play with the sorting without people understanding how they're doing it? Well, I would argue that they should be paternalistic for at least a couple of reasons. First of all, do people really understand what 98.3 means? Or what 73.9 EPP means? Or what 3.5 stars mean? We're all coming with different ideas of what it means. Whereas the platform has a lot more information on what sellers did, and they could translate that into the likelihood that you will actually be happy for the transaction. And that also means that, what about differences in experience and cognition? So people who have bought a lot on a site, and the platform sees that they're actually buying a variety of things that are not that extremely high quality compared to someone else who seems to really care about the quality, they could then show different rankings to different people. The key is that these platforms have the incentive to keep their buyers happy, because when their buyers are not happy, that's when the buyers are going to stop coming. Then we also have to ask, well, how will sellers react if we release this hidden information to the buyers? Or even tell the sellers how we're ranking them? Well, the example that I gave you, if now sellers know that silence is being held against them, they're going to be very aggressive for buyers to leave feedback. But then that might take away the signal from the noise. So there's a benefit for the platform that has the incentive to create long-term happiness, to figure out a secret sauce that works, and basically not tell people how they're doing it. That leads to other potential challenges, which is the whole call for regulation. There are many public voices now that say these platforms are becoming too big and too powerful and all that stuff. We need to regulate them. Like, whoa, get off your horses. Because let's figure out whether the platform has the incentives to actually do good things for consumer welfare and outcomes, or bad things. In the case of product quality, well, multi-homing, which means that buyers could go to many different platforms, is real and prevalent. Buyers buy from all sorts of platforms. If a platform like eBay or any other platform is not going to self-regulate, they will lose customers to other platforms. And therefore, they do have the incentives, at least along the lines of quality provision, to provide the best quality transactions and create the ranking algorithms that make customers happy. So to conclude, marketplaces have a lot of different ways to approach this problem. More of a hard hand ranking, market-based, letting sellers buy their reputation in order to improve the quality of sellers and the matches with buyers. And using this idea of economist as social engineer is a useful way to take ideas from economic theory and insights that economists have about revealed preference, reputation, signaling games, and apply them in ways that help solve this missing market feature of reputation, namely data that correlates with seller quality can be used to promote or demote high and low quality sellers, and we could use different forms of markets to let good sellers promote themselves. And finally, how this data is used by the platforms may best be left secret, because that secret sauce helps keep the players at bay and takes away their ability to manipulate and change the quality of the information that the platform has. And with that, I'm done, and I'm happy to take any questions.